Began a lesson there a couple of weeks ago, and we're going to finish that lesson today. 2 Kings 18, we have Hezekiah was ruling as the king of Judah, and we see that the mighty Assyrian nation, who has been conquering the world all around them, is now pressuring the nation of Judah. They have already gone to the city of Lachish, and they've laid siege to that city, and now they are coming against Jerusalem. And we have King Sennacherib send some of his ambassadors, send some of his representatives to Jerusalem to speak to the leaders of Jerusalem, to try to get them to capitulate, to try to get them to give in and allow Assyria to take them captive and to rule over them. And what we notice in that conversation that takes place between these ambassadors is we see the nature, I believe, of temptation. The conversation that Rabshakeh has with some of the leaders of Israel is very similar to what we see and how Satan tempts man throughout the Scriptures and how he tempts us today. What we noticed a couple of weeks ago when we looked at 2 Kings 18 is that in Rabshakeh, in his conversation with these leaders, he spoke lies to them about his purpose and why he came to Jerusalem. He tried to get them to believe these lies. He said, "It was your Lord who told me to come and subjugate you." Now, why he might have said that, he possibly could have heard rumors of the prophecies from Isaiah, who mentioned that Assyria was going to come and they were going to take Judah captive. But we see, no matter what the case is of why he said this, it's based in a lie because he doesn't believe in Jehovah God. He doesn't believe in the power of the Lord. He makes that abundantly clear in his conversation. He doesn't believe in Jehovah at all, so he's just using this as a tactic to try to persuade Judah to give in. And we notice that with Satan also from the very beginning. The first temptation that we see in Genesis 3. What does Satan do with Eve? He lies to Eve about what God has said. And in that lie, he gets Eve to believe the lie. And Eve gives in to that temptation. We know Satan does the same to us today. He tries to present things in a way that aren't necessarily true, but he presents sin in a good way. He presents sin in an appeasing way. And he tries to get us to believe that sin will lead us to a better life. And we'll speak more about that in the 11 a.m. hour. And then we noticed he heavily emphasized throughout his conversation, Rabshakeh did, he was trying to get them to doubt the power of the Lord, doubt that the Lord was with them, and doubt that the Lord would be able to deliver them. He hits home on this message time and time again. Verse 19, Rabshakeh said to them, "Say now to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, what is this confidence that you have? You say, but they are only empty words. I have counsel and strength for the war. Now, on whom do you rely? That you have rebelled against me." He continues at the end of his speech in verse 32. He says, verse 31, he says, "Don't listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me and come out to me." At the end of verse 32, do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you, saying, "The Lord will deliver us." Has any of the gods of the nations delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Seraphim, Hena, and Eva? Have they delivered Samaria from my hand? Whom among all the gods of the lands have delivered their land from my land, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem from my hand? All throughout that conversation, Rabshakeh is trying to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of those in Jerusalem. If you remember in that conversation, the leaders of Judah came to Rabshakeh, and as he was speaking, they asked him to speak to him in Aramaic, for we understand Aramaic. They didn't want the people who were on the wall to hear what Rabshakeh was saying unless it places doubt in their minds. But Rabshakeh, instead, he spoke louder so that all of Judah could hear what he had to say. And his message was, don't trust in your Lord. Look at what has already happened to Israel. Look at what has happened to some of the other cities of Judah. The Lord hasn't delivered them. The Lord isn't going to deliver you. We emphasized Satan does the same thing to us today. One of Satan's greatest tools is to try to get us to lose our hope, to try to get us to doubt God, to doubt God's love, to doubt God's salvation. And just like what was happening here with Assyria, he does it in a difficult and trying time. They have seen Assyria conquering all these nations. They might be living in fear of what Assyria is going to do to them. And so he comes at this difficult time and he plants these seeds of doubt. The same doubt that Satan will try to plant in our mind today. If Satan can get us to lose our hope, if he can attack at that, as the Hebrew writer describes it, as what should be the anchor of our soul, then he's going to be able to get a foothold into our lives. Because if we're not living with hope, then what are we living with? If you're not living with a hope for something greater beyond this life, a hope in the promises of God, then what is that going to lead you to live for? It's going to lead you to live for just the pleasures of today. It's going to lead you to live for yourself. So if Satan can get you to doubt, if he can get you to question God, then he's going to begin to build a strong foothold in your life. And then the last thing we looked at 2 weeks ago was that Satan will try to get us to compromise our faith. It is what Rabshakeh did to these Jews on this day. Verse 23, he says, "Now therefore come and make a bargain with my master, the king of Assyria. And I will give you 2,000 horses if you are able on your part to set riders on them." Even in the midst of getting them to try to compromise, he makes fun of them. He knows that he is in the more powerful situation in terms of man's view. But he makes that offer. He says, come make a bargain with us. Compromise with us. Verse 31 we read earlier. He says, "Do not listen to Hezekiah. Thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me and come out to me and eat each of his vine and each of his fig tree." He wants Jerusalem to make a compromise with the king, to give in, to capitulate, to let Assyria take you captive. And he makes the promise that we will provide for you. And we'll study that promise in the 11 a.m. hour. And then today, this morning, another tool that Rabshakeh uses, that I believe Satan uses often in our lives, is that he was trying to get them to see God's laws as overbearing and restrictive. Because Rabshakeh didn't truly understand the law of the Lord. And so when we go back to this context, it's very interesting, one of the tactics that he uses as he is going through this conversation. And he says in verse 22, he says, "But if you say to me, we trust in the Lord our God," again trying to create that doubt, but what is the reasoning he uses? He says here, if you say we trust in the Lord our God, is it not He whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has taken away and has said to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem? That is a very interesting tactic that Rabshakeh is using, and it is a tactic that would be affected on those who might not be familiar with God's law, might not know God's will for how they were to worship Him. But you can see how it might be effective. Hezekiah, he comes in as a king, and he begins to usher in many reforms. And one of those reforms is he does, as Rabshakeh mentions, he destroys the high places. And Rabshakeh is trying to use that as a means of, really he's trying to be deceitful and a means of trickery in this conversation, saying, you're going to rely on the Lord, but Hezekiah, saying through his actions, he's really showing that he isn't relying on the Lord, because he's destroying all these high places that you could go to and be able to worship the Lord. He's taking those things away from you. And that might be persuasive to those who lived maybe further away from Jerusalem and didn't want to travel all the way to Jerusalem to come together on the various feast days and to worship God. That might sound like an attractive proposition. And it might sound, he's making a lot of sense. Why did Hezekiah do that? If we desire to worship the Lord. Yet Rabshakeh did not understand the will of God. He did not understand the law of God. The Geneva Study Bible, and talking about this passage, he says, thus the idolaters think that God's religion is destroyed when superstition and idolatry are reformed. Those high places were set up. It is interesting when they are set up because you can read that there is, on one hand, maybe a desire to worship Jehovah the Lord from those high places, but at the same time, what do we see always happens? It's idolatry is always associated with these high places. That they bring in their own idols and they also worship those idols on those high places. And those high places were never to be set up. That is why Hezekiah went through these reforms. Hezekiah was doing that which was righteous. Just earlier in 2 Kings 18, 2 Kings 18 in verse 3, describing the reign of Hezekiah, it says, he did right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. And what did that consist of? He removed the high places. He broke down the sacred pillars and cut down the Asherah. He also broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the sons of Israel burned incense to it. In verse 5, he trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor among those who were before him. For he clung to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept his commandments which the Lord had commanded Moses. We see a similar description of what Hezekiah did in 2 Chronicles 31. 2 Chronicles 31, but in verse 20, it says, thus Hezekiah did throughout all Judah, and he did what was good, right, and true before the Lord his God. Every work which he began in the service of the house of God, in law and in commandment, seeking his God, he did with all his heart and prospered. Everything that Hezekiah did was righteous. It says he sought the Lord with all his heart. It says he clung to the Lord. He did not depart from the Lord. And a part of that righteous acts of Hezekiah was destroying those high places. When you go throughout all the kings of Judah, you will see the phrase that they did right in the sight of the Lord, except that they did not take down the high places. Hezekiah was a man, in a sense, after God's own heart. He went further. He was willing to take that next step. and he destroyed many of these high places. And yet in doing that, Rabshakeh tries to use that as an opportunity to attack Hezekiah and his rule, and to say that, Hezekiah doesn't really want you to rely on God because he's destroyed these high places where you can go and worship God. And so, in what Hezekiah is doing and following actually what is true and what is right, Rabshakeh is trying to plant seeds of doubt in their minds that no, what Hezekiah is doing is restrictive. It's overbearing. It's actually keeping us from the ability to worship God and rely on God. This is the same tool that Satan uses today against us. The world around us, the religious world around us, often might ask us the question as a church, why don't you do this or why don't you do that? They might see how we worship God as restrictive. Why isn't your church involved in all these different type of social activities? You think about the institutional church and the institutions that have been added to the church as a way to proclaim the gospel they believe to the world around them. They might ask, why aren't you doing that? Don't you want to spread the truth, and don't you want to spread the gospel all around? Well, we believe the church is all sufficient to do that. Ephesians 4 tells us that. We believe we must follow the law of the Lord, and we must have authority from the Lord in all that we do. We see this principle throughout Scriptures, that God's law is preeminent, and that in all that we do we must follow His law. You think about the example of Uzzah. If you'll turn just a few chapters back to 1 Chronicles 13. 1 Chronicles 13, here is a fascinating story to learn about the nature of God, the law of God, and what God expects from His followers. Because we're going to see in this story, even David seems a bit perplexed at the reaction that God has to Uzzah. But in 1 Chronicles 13, we know David has become king, and he desires the ark that has been taken. He desires to bring the ark back into the city so that the ark of God, the ark of the Lord, is with him. Obviously, that is a good thing to desire and a good thing to want to do. So he assembles all Israel together to bring the ark of God from Kiriath-Jearim in verse 5. Verse 6, David and all Israel went up to Baalah, that is, to Kiriath-Jearim, which belongs to Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, the Lord who is enthroned above the cherubim, where His name is called. They carried the ark of God on a new cart from the house of Abinadab, and Uzzah and Ahio drove the cart. David and all Israel were celebrating before God with all their might, even with songs, with lyres, harps, tambourines, cymbals, and with trumpets. When they came to the threshing floor of Chidon, Uzzah put out his hand to hold the ark, because the oxen nearly upset it. The anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, so he struck him down, because he put out his hand to the ark, and he died there before God. Then David became angry because of the Lord's outbursts against Uzzah, and he called that place Perez Uzzah to this day. David was afraid of God that day, saying, "How can I bring the ark of God home to me?" So David did not take the ark with him to the city of David, but took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. So here you have this story. What were David and the nation of Israel trying to do? They were trying to do a good thing. They were trying to do a righteous thing in bringing the ark of God back to the city of David. And in this process, we see they even go out, they get a new cart. They realize that this is something important, the ark of God, so They're not going to place it on an old cart, so they place it on a new cart in verse 7. And then verse 8, you have David and Israel. It says they're celebrating with all their might. They have these songs, they're playing music. So they have all this zeal, they have this passion, they have this fervor. They are filled and they are celebrating with all their might. They're zealous in what they are doing. But no amount of zeal, no amount of passion or fervor or spirit can overcome disobedience to the laws and the commands of God. They had the zeal, they had the fervor. That means absolutely nothing if they do not have the truth to go along with it. In fact, one of the most dangerous combinations that we see in Scripture and that we see in the religious world is zeal and passion and fervor without the truth. That leads to such a dangerous realm where you rely on your own wisdom, you rely on your own thoughts, and you think if you're just passionate enough and zealous enough in your service to the Lord that the Lord is going to accept it. But when we continue that story, despite Israel celebrating before God with all their might, we see the anger of the Lord reaches out and it strikes down Uzzah. And David, it says he becomes angry. That word, there's a grief and it says anger involved in that word. He seems very perplexed. Is he angry with the Lord? Is he angry about the situation? I don't know exactly. It says he's angry because of the outburst against Uzzah. And it kind of puts him in a proper place. It says he was afraid of God that day. It puts him back to having the proper fear and respect for the Lord. And David, it says he doesn't know how to bring back the ark home. He says, how do I bring the ark of God home to me? But you go just a couple of chapters later, chapter 15. What does David find out? Well, it appears David reads the law a little closer. It says David built houses for himself in the city of David, and he prepared a place for it, the ark of God, and pitched a tent for it. Then David said, no one is to carry the ark of God but the Levites, for the Lord chose them to carry the ark of God and to minister to Him forever. That's exactly what Numbers 7 and verse 9 says. It says the sons of Kohath were to carry the articles on their shoulders. David turns to the law, and when David turns to the law, he finds out what God's desire was. He finds out how he can transport the ark back to the city of David. Verse 15, verse 14, verse 13, we'll keep backing up. Verse 13, because you did not carry it at the first, the Lord our God made an outburst on us. For why? For we did not seek Him according to the ordinance. So the priests and the Levites consecrated themselves to bring up the ark of the Lord God of Israel. The sons of the Levites carried the ark of God on their shoulders with the poles thereon, as Moses had commanded according to the word of the Lord. David goes back to the law. He reads the law. He sees God's desire. He explains to these Levites. He understands now. Why did God have this outburst against them on that day when Uzzah was killed? He says, because we did not seek Him according to the ordinance. He went back to the law. He found what God's will was. He found what the truth was. And they then carried the ark. And now we see the same scene as you continue there in 1 Chronicles 15. There they are, David and the elders of Israel and the captains over the thousands. They bring the ark back, and they bring it back with joy. They're shouting, and the sound of the horn and the trumpets and loud-sounding cymbals with harps and lyres. And David is again celebrating as they bring it back. So it is important to have the right spirit, to have the zeal, to have the fervor. But what we see from this story is that it must be accompanied with doing everything according to God's will, of seeking out His ordinances. And I bring up this story in connection to what we're talking about because some might view that as overbearing and restrictive. They might see God's reaction. That seems extreme to strike down Uzzah on that day when all they seemed to be doing was trying to please God. They're trying to bring back the ark of the Lord. What we learn from that is God desires that His will be followed. Rabshakeh saying, taking down these high places, he's restricting you from your ability to worship God. No, he's following the law of God. He's following the will of God. But Rabshakeh tried to plant that seed of doubt, and Satan does the same to us today. You might have been asked, why don't you have instruments of music in your worship? And have people with the ability to play instruments and play them beautifully. Why I've had it described in this way. If you have a talent in that way, why wouldn't you want to use it to serve and to worship God? Well, because it's not according to the will of God. When we look at the New Testament, we see we have been commanded to sing. We see no command to play instruments before God. And so when we see no command to do that, we follow God's law. Like I mentioned earlier, the people ask, why aren't you involved in all these social activities, feeding the homeless as a church, doing all these various things? Why don't you have these various youth ministries? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Because we believe, like we read in Colossians 3, that whatever we do in word or deed, we are to do all in the name of the Lord. James 1, verse 25 and 26 tells us that we have been given the perfect law of liberty. We've been given a law just like they were given a law under the old covenant. We are to seek out that law. We are to follow that law. And when we go beyond that law, we can understand from the Scriptures that God's wrath will be poured out upon us. And so we seek to do everything with the same zeal and the same spirit that David had, but that zeal and that spirit must be accompanied with following His will and following His truth. And this temptation isn't just seen, we spoke of it mainly in regards to the church as a whole and our worship and our work as a church, but that temptation is there as individuals also. And I see it more and more, Satan's desire to try to twist God's law and try to get you in your mind to begin to plant seeds of doubts, to think things that you once believed were morally corrupt, things that were evil, things that are wrong, and you can go to the Scriptures and see these things. He tries to get you to, just slowly plant those seeds in your minds that, no, those people are being overbearing. They're being way too restrictive when they talk about God and His law in that way. And I hear too many men and women who call themselves Christians beginning to lighten and loosen the bounds of God's law. When it comes to social drinking, or when it comes to things like gambling, when it comes to issues of modesty, those people are just being too restrictive, being too overbearing. Just dress however you desire to dress. Or one drink isn't bad. Gambling on the golf course or gambling, in fantasy football or whatever it may be, that you think God really cares about those things? And so they try to plant seeds of doubt. They try to say people who hold to those views are overbearing and restrictive. They try to get you to go further and further away from God's law. Rabshakeh did it then. Satan does it all throughout the Scriptures, and he does it to us today. Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 2, going back to why Hezekiah did what he did and why David, found out how they needed to transport the ark. God gave them that warning in Deuteronomy when he was giving them the law. He says, "You shall not add to the word which I am commanding you, nor take away from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I have commanded you." God's laws are not meant to be overbearing. They're not meant to be overly restrictive. God's laws were always meant for the benefit of His people. They are a blessing to His people when they follow them. They bring peace, they bring hope, they bring joy, and they bring comfort in our lives. They keep us away from the dangers and the temptations of sin. I think of Matthew 7. Matthew 7 reminds me of this story of David and Uzzah, as David seemed to be perplexed about what happened on that day. We see a same scene described here by Jesus in His Sermon on the Mount. And in verse 21, He says, Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. He describes a scene here on the judgment day where it seems to describe there will be a great number of people who are caught by surprise at the judgment of the Lord. They will stand before the Lord, and He describes it in their minds. They'll say, Did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not cast out demons in your name? Did we not do all these things in your name? But He says the Lord's response will be, Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. And why is that? It is because they did not do the will of the Father. Let's think about these things this morning. And let's think about this story from Rabshakeh and see that it is a story that still greatly applies to our lives today. Rabshakeh wanted them to see what Hezekiah was doing. He wanted them to see it as overbearing and restrictive. Satan does the same thing to us today. We have to be able to see it. In the 11 a.m. hour, we're going to talk about this last point that Rabshakeh tried to use. He tried to get them to believe that he was offering them a good life and a better life. Satan does the same thing to us today. I thank you for your kind attention this hour. If you're here this morning and you have not yet obeyed the gospel, then why not now? If you're living in sin and you need those sins to be washed away, come forward believing that Jesus is the Christ, that He came to this earth, He lived a life without sin, then He gave up His life as that perfect sacrifice on the cross, that through His blood you can have the forgiveness of sins. And just as God raised Him from the dead, the power of God can raise you from that water. If you go down into that water in faith, God will raise you having wiped away all of your sins. And you can have fellowship with God. If you owe that duty to the Lord, we ask that you come now as we stand and sing